The B-29 was, without doubt, the best bomber of the Second World War, and also one of the most deeply flawed. Even carrying a heavy load, it could fly further, faster and higher than anything else in service. It made the B-17 look Stone Age, the Lancaster look anemic by comparison. It was a quantum leap in bomber technology, yet it almost missed the wall. It was plagued by lethal problems, and it cost far more to develop than the A-bomb, which it eventually carried, and it was rendered almost obsolete immediately after Japan's surrender. And so today we're going to look at the $3.7 billion bet that was the B-29 Superfortress. Hello, my name is Lord Hardthrasher, Chair of the Order of the Brown Envelope, Custodian of Queen Camilla's Howdah, and proud member for the Society of the Disembowelment of Slavers with Rusty Kitchen Utensils. And you, my lovely little friend, have clicked on this video because, with any luck, you wish to learn about the B-29 Superfortress. Why you clicked on this one and not any of the numerous other videos that are out there on the subject, I shall leave between you and your optician. However, I have decided to cover this for a few reasons. Most obviously because it's a fucking cool plane. I mean, just look at the damn thing. And because it was both a flawed project and a flawed aircraft, that makes it quite interesting to discuss. Everyone likes to bitch about the prettiest girl in class. Also, it gives me an excuse to do some follow-on videos about exactly how it was used during the course of the bomber war in both the CBI and the Pacific, and that's quite cool. And finally, because I find myself in need of funds somewhat urgently, as my manservant Jenkins is prone to pointing out daily, often with an irritating smile on his face, her ladyship will be returning from her villa in Lesbos any day now, and due to an incident involving the ornamental duck pond, the local public house and her Land Rover, I have a significant reupholstery bill to pay. So, a video about the B-29 seems to be just the thing. The list of stuff the B-29 either did first, or just bigger and better than everybody else, is kind of staggering. First off, it was fucking massive. I mean, it was 99 feet long, which was comfortably longer than anything operated by the British. It had a wingspan of 141 feet. That's 40% more than even the large Avro Lancaster. It could fly further with a bigger load than anything else. On paper, at least, it was meant to be able to carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, but more realistically, it meant running an 1,800-mile range with 10,000 pounds, which is still incredibly impressive. The Lanc could carry that load, but not as high and nothing like as far, whilst the B-17 going to Berlin, a trip of 1,200 miles or so, could only carry 4,500 pounds of bombs. It had not one, but two bomb bays because freedom knows no bounds, and also the second bay could be used to put fuel in for long trips. With four 54-litre Wright Cyclone R-3350 engines, each kicking out 2,200 horsepower, it was a vastly powerful aircraft. I mean, in theory, at least. We'll come back to the engines in a bit. With fuel and bombs, the B-29 could weigh as much as 140,000 pounds on takeoff. That it could fly at all was down to the seriously beautiful and very clever design of the thin wings, which allowed it to get up to 32,000 feet, and indeed higher once one or two of the features that we'll discuss later were sorted out. To give the crew a chance during the 18-hour-long trips that it was, at least on paper, capable of doing, all 11 or 12, depending on the configuration and the mission type, of the crew were housed in pressurised cabins fore and aft. Connecting them was a 34-inch diameter tunnel which ran over the top of the twin bomb bays, down which crew could, assuming that they hadn't had too much ice cream, move to get from the front cabin to the back. The tail gunner sat behind his 20mm cannon in his own compartment from which he could not move because, I don't know, fuck that guy, I guess. Talking of guns, this of course is a US plane in World War II, so naturally it is kind of a forest of weapons, but unlike, say, the B-24 or the B-17, this thing used remote gun turrets. They even built one with a total of 23 guns on it as a dedicated gun platform, but that version didn't really take off, thank God. As standard, it was designed with 4 gun turrets with twin 50 cals, which were, technologically speaking, years ahead of their time. To control them, the aircraft had an inbuilt system called the Central Fire Control Computer, which was abbreviated to CFC, which looked like something that bloody stupid Johnson would have put together. This meant that the gunners could sit in blisters using remote-controlled sights, which is cool in and of itself, but the real secret sauce was the massive wires, pulleys, batteries, and electrical systems which came together to allow any of the gunners' positions to override another gun station and point both guns at the same lucky son of the Emperor as they came into range. I am but a humble member of the landed gentry, and my dear governess, God rest her spanking arm, didn't really teach me about engineering, so I can't explain much beyond that except observing, fuck me, that's cool. But if you do want to know more, then you really should go and check out the detail in Alexander Okay's video on the subject, which is mind-blowing. You might think, given how advanced this system was, that would mean that it broke the whole time, but surprisingly, it just kind of worked. In June 1945, 20th Air Force fired 1.1 million 50 cal rounds through 30,000 guns, and it suffered just 163 stoppages. That is kind of insane for a system as novel as this. The tricycle undercarriage that the B-29 sported was new on a heavy bomber. It was a well-known idea elsewhere, but what it meant was on a plane this large, it was far easier to handle on the ground, especially on rough, untarmacked field, where being able to maneuver something this big might be really fucking helpful. The wing shape, which we talked a minute ago about, was kind of Boeing's classic design. It was an upscaled version of the B-17, but strengthened, as was the tail assembly. Before we go back to the mid-1930s and look at how the Americans managed to spend several $1 billion building an aeroplane that occasionally attempted to cremate its own crew, a brief word from today's sponsor, World of Warships. I mentioned at the start the challenges I faced regarding Her Ladyship's favourite Land Rover, and whilst I maintain some of the eyewitnesses are of a decidedly questionable character, I am nonetheless extremely grateful to World of Warships for contributing to the restoration fund and, potentially, my continued survival. World of Warships is a free-to-play, massive online multiplayer naval combat game that lets you command over 850 historically accurate vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines. It's constantly evolving and updating, and every month there are new ships, new nations, events, cosmetics, and so on. As a result, there are new maps, new water effects, new lighting, and new weather, all included in the current version of the game. Choose a nation, build your fleet, and then discover whether your tactical instincts are those of Admiral Lord Nilsson and join a division, or perhaps you're more of an Admiral Beatty type and want to go it solo. Just don't blame me if you are left wondering what is wrong with your bloody ships today, whilst all around you burns. Best of all, if you're playing on console, you can play too through World of Warships Legends. Use the link in the description and the pinned comment, together with the code IMPACTFORCE, to receive 20 days of premium access, the Japanese Tier 3 cruiser Tenryū, and a commander and a port slot, which is all pretty neat. But better yet, you'll unlock the US Tier 7 cruiser Boise, 7 Supercontainers, 40 million credits, and 1 million Elite Commander XP once you start the progression mode. And frankly, this is a ridiculous offer which costs you nothing to do. So sign up now. It supports me and possibly prevents me from being beaten to death with the collected works of a long-dead poet. Thank you once again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the birth of the B-29. The birth of super-large bombers in the United States, at least, goes back to 1934, when the USAAC, that's the United States Army Air Corps, as it was called at the time, issued a list of its requirements for, and I quote here, long-range airplane suitable for military purposes. And gods aren't those words to conjure with. It's like Shakespeare. From the late 1920s, Boeing had been one of the world's most innovative manufacturers for the civilian market. They built all-metal aircraft like the monomail and multi-engined planes like the Boeing Model 247 to much acclaim. At great expense and at their own risk, looking at that 1934 requirement, Boeing developed something called the XB-15, which was part amazing technical showcase and part steampunk fever dream. The wing, as for instance, was so wide that engineers could actually clamber around inside it whilst the aircraft was in flight to conduct repairs, which, my God. It could, at least hypothetically, fly for 5,000 miles, but the furthest it ever actually flew in reality was just over 3,000 miles, which is still hugely impressive. It did take a while, though, because it was desperately underpowered and only achieved a top speed of 150 mph. It was cool, for sure, but also a testbed, for sure, not a serious bomber proposal. Pretty much at the same time, Boeing was working on the Model 299, which would then go on to become the B-17, and it took a huge number of ideas that it developed in the XB-15 and dropped them into the 299. Even as the 299 went to trials, though, it was looking a bit old hat. Its bomb capacity was at best mediocre. Its range was very short, really, for a strategic bomber. It couldn't climb high enough when it was loaded with weapons, and it looked like Congress wasn't going to back it anymore anyway. However, things changed fundamentally when, on the 29th of September 1938, Henry Hap Arnold became Chief of the United States Army Air Corps. Hap was a man who'd learnt to fly back in 1911. He'd shown immense personal courage and drive as one of the early pioneers of aviation, setting several personal records as a pilot. He was passionate about developing air power into an independent strategic force in the US. Perhaps too passionate, actually. By the end of the war, he would suffer a number of heart attacks. He, like many others, saw bombing as a potential war-winning strategy that would take the fight into the heart of the enemy's economy, basically for the first time. With an ongoing war in China, and with war in Europe a near certainty in the near future, he threw his weight behind the strategic bombing program in the US, getting the B-17 built in numbers, but also at the same time seeking out a replacement because he knew that airframe wasn't up to it. In February of 1940, he launched something called Requirement R40B, an urgent request for industry to look at a super long-range, super heavy, high-altitude bomber that might theoretically be able to fly from the mainland United States to Asia or Europe and back. Arnold ensured that, unlike previous programs, there was money, commitment, and political will behind the concept, which just left industry there to be able to provide the technology, which gave everybody a lot of confidence that it was worth investing in as a program this time, even if they were all a little skeptical about the overall project objectives. Where before there had been no money but plenty of time, now there was no time, but Arnold ensured that there was at least plenty of money. Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, Consolidated, and a little bit later Martin all put forward designs and all got money for their design studies, labelling their respective aircraft XB-29 to XB-33, of which, realistically, Boeing's XB-29 and Consolidated's XB-32 were really the only serious proposals. Time was a-ticking, and just 3 months later, Boeing was able to submit XB-29 as a design study back to Wright Field in May, suggesting that the aircraft should be able to fly at 370 miles an hour, have a ceiling of 38,000 feet, and have a 5,000-mile range whilst carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs. Now, look, I'm not going to suggest that Boeing overpromising and underdelivering has become a pattern over the years, but with the exception of the bomb load, none of these figures proved to be correct. Still, at least they learnt from their experience and they don't do that sort of thing anymore. With vast amounts of money, Arnold's backing, and some of the best technical minds in the US aviation, and a clarity of purpose that was truly terrifying to behold, it took Boeing just 2 years and 4 months to get the XB-29 from a pure pencil design to an actually flyable aircraft. XB-29 No. 1, in her olive drab livery, first flew in September 1942 and was quickly followed by XB-29 No. 2, and immediately there were problems. Between that first flight in September and the end of December, just 23 flights were conducted due to technical issues and bad weather, a total of a little under 46 hours of flying time. That's not really good enough in a highly compressed development timescale. Unfortunately, on February the 18th, 1943, XB-29 No. 2, piloted by the highly experienced Eddie Allen, caught fire and began to burn. Allen tried to recover the situation, bringing it in for an emergency landing, but at just 250 feet, the fires cut through the wing spar, causing the wing to fold like cardboard and the plane to plummet earthward. 3 crew members tried to jump, but their chutes couldn't deploy at that low altitude and they hit the ground and were killed. The aircraft then plunged into the Frey meatpacking plant, killing 8 of the remaining crew and 19 people on the ground. This was bad for 3 reasons. Firstly, a lot of people had just died. Secondly, no one really had a clue what had caused the crash. And thirdly, America's brand new, highly secret bomber had just crashed into downtown Seattle. From a security point of view, this was tricky, to say the least. For the program as a whole, this was pretty disastrous. The United States Army Air Corps had ordered 250 of these new planes at a cool $2.6 million per airframe. That's about $50 million in today's money, even before the US had entered the war. They'd ordered another 500 in January, and then another 900 in February, which brought the total to 1,650 before an airscrew had even turned. This had all been done on the assumption that production would start quickly, would ramp up, and would peak in about June of 1944, making that investment at least look useful in a foreseeable timescale. But this crash threw all of those assumptions, all of that money, all those people's reputations basically out the window. Boeing was having kittens about being involved in what might become one of the greatest white elephants in US history. It took 4 months for investigators to work out exactly what had happened and for test flying to resume. Turned out it was probably a relatively easy-to-fix issue on the turbo superchargers, which had overheated combined with a fuel flow leak. To try and get things back on track and to instill some confidence in the program, Arnold insisted that General Kenneth Wolfe took over the program and that Army Air Force test pilots got to do the flying, which at least meant things got moving again, although it was an uphill battle. Much as Boeing might have liked to carry on using the imaginatively titled Plant 1 and Plant 2 in Renton, Seattle to build the B-29, they actually needed a new facility. Actually, they needed more than that. They needed partners to also build new facilities to just cope with the potential demand. And that in turn meant drafting in Bell and Martin to help and Douglas to make various components. Co-opetition is the modern term, I'm told, for such arrangements. I prefer to think of it more of a dog's breakfast, but there you go. Most important was the siting of the new factory for Boeing, from which the bulk of the B-29s would presumably appear at some point in the near future. There then came about an unusual mixture of government intervention, a smidgen of racism, profit hunting, and some bizarre paranoia, which combined to make everything much, much more difficult than it probably should have been. Boeing scouted around the country to try and find a suitable location and eventually settled on Wichita, Kansas. Now, this was not an obvious choice. On the face of it, there's no particular aviation heritage there. There's no large-scale manufacturing there really of any kind in 1941, and it only had a population of about 100,000 people. However, if you look at it on a map, suddenly a few things begin to slide into focus. Firstly, this is the United States at the height of their invasion scares, and Wichita is pretty much slap bang in the middle of the US. So, in the highly likely scenario where Japan or Germany somehow launched a transoceanic invasion of the continental US, the plant would be safe. I mean, my brothers and sisters in Christ, I love you very much, but the chances of the Kriegsmarine and the IJN being able to find their asses with both hands and somehow fight off the Royal Navy or the USN, or potentially both at the same time, to invade continental America, it was never going to happen, but I guess it was a consideration at the time, so we just have to note it and move on. Less edifyingly, Wichita was both 95% white and 98% American-born, making it one of the most monotone cities in the United States. And this was thought to be really important because obviously all foreigners are either Nazis or communists or trade unionists or some horrific mixture of the three, and it's not like Boeing's management was in the business of empowering African Americans to get into engineering jobs. An additional benefit, aside from labour relations and security, was household income, which in the area was about 10 to 15% lower than the average in the US, meaning lots of cheap local labour, which they thought was a good idea. Moreover, Uncle Sam and Kansas state legislature had been trying to find manufacturing jobs to get into the state for basically years, and they were delighted to have Boeing willing to invest in this huge new plant, and so they offered them some massive bribes. Tax incentives, to Boeing. Boeing broke ground on not one, but actually two factories in Wichita in late 1941, which opened in January of 1943, and that is where the wheels came off this genius plan. See, the problem was, as I noted a minute ago, Wichita is in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. The few labourers who were around had almost zero engineering experience outside, say, servicing a tractor, and whilst I'm not going to knock Big Jimmy's ability to get Grandpa's far more regular going on a cold morning, it isn't quite the same thing as handling the 11 miles of electrical cable that goes into a B-29. Moreover, Jimmy, and indeed all of Jimmy's mates, were about to get their asses drafted. This had two effects. First of all, half the workforce would be women, almost none of whom had done anything like this before, and the second was that the Boeing management team suddenly had to learn how to cope with women in the workforce, which they had no clue how to do. This was going to be a steep learning curve for everyone. By January 1944, there would be 29,400 workers at Wichita, and the population of the city itself had nearly doubled. This rapid growth, combined with relative inexperience and huge pressure to, make the plane, was a bit of a recipe for a disaster. With General Motors, Martin, Bell, North American and many others involved in making large parts and indeed small ones, the B-29 program was very much not all in Boeing's hands, with them having to ship out machine tools and parts and then take parts back in again from across the United States, all of which necessitated massively long journeys because of where they decided to locate themselves. Unsurprisingly then, the Wichita factory was short of pretty much everything all the time. Central fire control computers, props, engine nacelles and engines in particular in November 1943, and it would remain critically short on parts well into 1944. By the end of January 1944, a full year after opening, Wichita had produced fewer than 100 airframes, of which only 16 could actually fly, and none of them passed the United States Army Air Force's Quality Control Board. They were miles away from producing anything which was combat-ready. When Hap Arnold discovered the scale of the problem, he went absolutely apeshit and demanded 175 bombers be ready by the 15th of April for combat deployment, and so began what became called the Battle of Kansas to get the line moving. This was easier said than done. The plant itself was not completely finished. Some sheds were still open to the air. Moreover, there were 100 aircraft that needed a mountain of retrofitting, which had to be done in the open in the middle of a Kansas winter, with temperatures well below freezing pretty much constantly. Workers found that they could only stand at their stations for 20 minutes at a time before having to go into warm-up breaks in specially heated tents. Operatives worked 6 days a week in 8-hour shifts around the clock to try and turn the situation around, and somehow they did manage to squeeze out the required airframes between the 26th of March and the 15th of April. This solved the immediate problem, but didn't really address the fundamentals. Over 54 major design changes, resulting in some 3,000 manufacturing changes, were adopted after production had begun in 1943. This wouldn't slow down during the lifetime of the B-29. There was almost no point at which the design was stable. And this meant that when planes were completed, they were not combat ready. So 4 rework centres had to be established across the United States, where an average of 10,000 further manufacturing hours were required to bring the airframe up to combat readiness. This continued for the entire life of the B-29. By the time all of this was going on, the US was spending a huge amount of effort to try and get the Chinese to, fight the Japanese rather than one another. And President Roosevelt had promised China's warlord leader, Chiang Kai-shek, the very latest, biggest and most badass bomber in the world would be deployed to China to start hitting the Japanese by the 1st of January 1944. It was pretty clear pretty quickly that that was in no way realistic. Even after the Battle of Canvas had apparently been won, the issues did not stop. In order to get the aircraft to operate out of China, they were going to have to be based in India, where at least they could be serviced. And that meant flying down the east coast of the United States, onto South America, over the Atlantic, over to North Africa, and then on to India itself. The first batch of planes that left in April followed this route, with 9 of them crashing or being written off en route, mostly due to engine and electrical faults. This then led to the entire fleet being grounded outside Cairo for 2 weeks, whilst additional parts were scratch-built and bolted onto the planes or sent out from the US. The net result was that it took until the 8th of May to get all 130 aircraft into their forward bases. Now, those of you who know a little bit about aircraft will perhaps have been keeping up with the dates there. You will know that developing a new plane, particularly one as novel as this, in 4 years is pretty bloody good. But also note that going from first flight to first deployment in 2 years in wartime points to some pretty basic issues with the plane's design. This was essentially technological overreach in many, many ways, compounded by a constant political drumbeat and a lot of money. There were a number of problems related to the aircraft which were common to most planes, but which were compounded by this speed that the development was going at and the build quality failures that we talked about earlier. For example, throughout the plane's service life, it was prone to sudden and catastrophic depressurizations, with guns blisters being ripped off in mid-flight. When this happened, it ejected the unfortunate crewmen into the void to plummet to their death. To counter this, they began to rig up safety harnesses, which arguably made things worse. In the event of a blowout, they would then find themselves in freezing temperatures with no oxygen, being slapped against the skin of the aircraft at over 200 miles an hour as crewmates fought to try and bring them back on board before oxygen deprivation killed them. My personal favourite was the discovery that the brakes would fade out really fast on landing, meaning pilots would suddenly find themselves unable to stop these giant planes, even though there were new pads fitted and the system had checked out just fine on takeoff. Upon examination, some kind of crystalline substance was found in the brake fluid, and initially sabotage was suspected. And then somebody realised that the brake line had been run through the same hole in the fuselage as the toilet exit, and on long flights, fluid could seep from one to the other, causing brake fluid to crystallise and stop working. Really taking the piss, that one. More serious engineering failures in the basic design also came to light as production went on. So, for example, the bomb bays took about 13 seconds to open and about 13 seconds to close, and I'm sure crews began to wonder if that number was unlucky for some. After all, you typically open the bomb bays at the last possible moment on approach to the target, where most of the gunfire is happening. Moreover, the 2 bomb bay doors couldn't actually be operated separately. It meant that if one bay was being used for fuel, there was more than a chance that you might suddenly bomb the enemy not just with 500-pounders, but also with your fuel tank. And if that happened, you would then run out of fuel and die somewhere in the Pacific, miles from home. Despite this coming to light in early August 1943, it wasn't until early 1945 that this problem was actually fixed when new doors were retrofitted to the fleet. It was quickly discovered that the fancy fire control systems being used to control the guns couldn't actually hit a barn door at 3 paces. The twin guns in each of the turrets interfered with one another and sprayed bullets around uncontrollably, and whilst to some extent you want a cone of fire headed toward the enemy, you do actually need to have some control over that cone. To try and fix this problem, the obvious choice was naturally, because this is America, to add 2 more guns to the turrets, starting with the front upper, but that actually made things infinitely worse. Only about 5% of all shots were likely to hit the target, at the cost of 200 miles of range and 3 miles an hour reduction in top speed. As Curtis LeMay reported, even after delivery of supposedly combat-ready aircraft began in India in 1944, the design still wasn't nailed down. There were another 1,000 further changes which needed to be made to each plane, each of which served to add weight in some way, quite aside from the maintenance nightmare that was having no 2 aircraft that were exactly the same. And if you're going to do a project like this under the pressure of war, to some extent, some of these failures are just inevitable flaws that are going to happen. But there was one place in the B-29 program which stands out above all others. The Wright Cyclone R-3350 that was selected for the project was not actually particularly new. It had first run back in 1937, and the design used carburetors, which were old hat by 1942, and they were air-cooled radial engines, which again was a bit passé by this point. But they were also potentially underdeveloped. They might be able to produce a lot more than the 2,200 horsepower that they were rated to. One of the challenges with an engine like this is just who's using it. How much has it been developed? How much have the problems been ironed out? And the answer in this case was really not at all. There wasn't a huge amount of demand for sodding great big turbo-supercharged engines like this in the civilian market into war. And even where they did start to try and use it, it wasn't until 1945 when Douglas stuck it in a single-seat ground attack aircraft. Pratt & Whitney's option, which was slightly less powerful and had been the main rival for the B-29 project, had a similarly gargantuan engine, and it too had only found limited applications. These things were just too big for the mainstream to use, and that meant that there were ideas embedded in the design of the engine which were deeply flawed, but which no one had diagnosed yet. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the 54-litre 18-cylinder nature of the R-3350, it was a monster. It weighed in a little over 2,600 pounds dry. For Europeans, that's about 1,200 kilograms. For context, that's more than a modern Mazda MX-5. Shit, actually, that's not a great example. More than a VW Polo. No. More than a Fiat 500. More than an Alfa Force. For fuck's sake. Look, it weighed a lot, okay? To try and cope with creeping weight problems during engine development, Curtiss-Wright had decided to use the lightest metal that it could for as many parts as possible. Specifically, that meant the extensive use of magnesium. Now, for those of you taking a sharp intake of breath, hold your horses. This is not quite as batshit as it sounds. Yes, magnesium can burn at over 3,000 degrees C. Yes, it will happily burn in the presence of pure nitrogen, steam, and even carbon dioxide, but most of the time it doesn't. In normal circumstances, it oxidizes, meaning it creates a nice protective layer around itself, which is actually quite hard to get through, and it means that it's much harder to set fire to than perhaps you'd think. Unless, someone designed a fuel system that had a habit of catching fire, because that would be super bad. If the fire was hot enough and in the wrong place, then that oxidized layer would be stripped off and the raw magnesium underneath would ignite and begin merrily cutting through the wing spar like a gas axe, killing everybody on board in short order, which may well have contributed to the B-29 No. 2 crash back in February of 1943. Worse, because there's no practical way of fighting a magnesium fire other than just hoping it burns through all that tasty metal quickly. It also means that if you do have an engine fire which is a magnesium fire, the chances of you learning about what caused it are exactly nil on account of the excitable metal that you've got inside the engine in the first place, which will just burn everything to fragments. So you learn nothing unless you get lucky. And if, say, you were trying to win a global war and under intense pressure from Boeing and the United States Army Air Force to just spaff these engines out as fast as humanly possible, cutting quality checks wherever you thought somebody wasn't looking, chances are you might just go to yourself, it'll probably go away. How much of a problem could it actually be? And the answer was, a lot. To cope with the expected demand, Wright had built its own new factory at a place called Woodridge in New Jersey. This was expected to produce about 850 engines a month from May 1943. But they paid the workers badly. It had a terrible managerial culture and uncontrolled leakage of workers who could, by this point, it's mid-war, go wherever the hell they wanted for better conditions and more money, led to a significant challenge around morale and industrial relations. Also, to augment their plant, they'd outsourced some of the production to Dodge, part of Chrysler. And I know this is going to come as a bit of a shock. Chrysler lied about what they could make and for what price in the hope of a fast buck. It took an intervention by Harry Truman's investigative committee to fix the problems at both plants and indeed to wrestle some control back over the whole project. And yes, you did hear Harry Truman's name there. He wasn't president at this point. There's a bit of an irony to that, but we'll come back to it in the future. Despite Truman's committee getting involved for most of 1943 and 44, Curtiss-Wright was blaming Boeing and Boeing was blaming Curtiss-Wright for the situation. Meanwhile, Hap Arnold between them was going slowly mental and having many heart attacks. The issue actually turned out to be a bit of fault on both sides, as is so often the case. First off, the massive size of the engine and its stroke meant that the carburetor system simply couldn't cope, so the air-to-fuel mixture in any given cylinder varied, sometimes by a lot. This meant very different power outputs on the same bank of cylinders, which could stress crankshafts and, if it was left alone, was prone to causing ports to open and shut when they shouldn't. The engine was very sensitive to heating, caused in part by poor oil circulation, which meant that valves could sometimes stick. Now, when this happened, it wasn't necessarily the end of the world. Sometimes it caused a cylinder to explode, which is not great, but you can sort of kind of cope with it. It might cause a bit of damage inside the engine, but it didn't automatically cause a fire. But you'd want to do something about it now that your engine was damaged. So the trick was to try and feather the 5-meter long prop blades. That is, you're going to try and turn them in edge onto the wind so that they don't continue to rotate, because if they do, they can start spraying bits of metal everywhere. Except, due to the engine's distressed state, this often didn't work. For reasons that surpass human understanding, on an aircraft where almost everything was electrical, the Hamilton-designed props were in fact hydraulic, and they required pressure in the engine in order to control pitch. So if the engine did begin to die like this, what would happen is that the hydraulic pressure would drop away and suddenly you couldn't feather the prop. It would then continue to try and rotate, which for a bit would be all right, because you'd pump out lots of hydraulic pressure and you pump out lots of oil and presumably fuel, but it might kind of be okay. But at some point that engine would seize up, and when it did, it would be like twisting the wing off a roast chicken, and then the engine would be torn out of that beautiful aerofoil. As a rule, engines being suddenly ripped out of your wings is considered a bit of a no-no for most pilots and crew, and often necessitates new flight suits following unexpected weight loss. It got so bad that there was some serious consideration given to putting an automatic ejection system for the engines into the aircraft, because it just happens so fucking often. However, sometimes it was much, much worse than even this, because in their infinite wisdom, Curtiss-Wright had made the fuel impellers out of the aforementioned magnesium, and occasionally, when the valve got stuck, the cylinder cycled hot exhaust gases out the way they'd come in, i.e. the engine would backfire straight into the fuel flow, where it would then ignite, which would definitely burn hot enough to cause that impeller to catch fire, spraying hot fuel and white-hot magnesium all around the engine bay, with all the attendants screaming and dying that one might imagine in a 54-litre petrol engine going full chat. This was Curtiss-Wright's fault. But why, you may ask, was the engine getting hot in the first place? Well, it turned out that there was not enough distance between the cylinder heads and the engine cowling. Curtiss-Wright were not wrong. Boeing had designed this badly. Well, they designed it badly from an engine point of view. See, the aim here was to try and build your massive fuck-off aeroplane as efficiently as possible. And that naturally meant you needed big wings. But big wings are the kinds that were used on, say, the X-15, created equally huge amounts of drag. So they needed to be low profile, so Boeing took what they learnt from the B-17's wings and sort of embiggened them, creating a highly efficient aerofoil shape, which was thin but also super strong. And at some point during the course of the design, the wing engineers had been forced with the problem of how do you actually integrate engines into this really quite beautiful design. They'd solved this with a very cleverly designed nacelle, which actually added structural integrity to the wings and had very beautiful drop-shaped covers. Sadly, aerodynamicists and engine designers don't necessarily always speak the same language, as you can see by looking at basically any F1 team over the years, and the resulting cowling shape meant that restricted airflow, which in turn led to overheating and then the fire and the death that we talked about before. In short, it was a design shitshow worthy of the lads at Heinkel. Now, all of these problems were slowly and painfully overcome. The cylinder heads were extended, a fuel injection system was brought in, the magnesium was largely taken out, oil fuel flow was improved, the cowling designs was changed, the valves themselves were changed, the way that the fuel pumps worked was changed, the shape of the crankcases was changed, and on and on and on and on. But all of this took time and, of course, lives to try and solve. And even in 1945, engine problems were all too common. I started all of this by saying that the B-29 was both a disaster and a technological triumph, and I stand by that statement. Whilst the B-29 production had been woefully slow to start off with, this is the United States in the Second World War we're talking about, those motherfuckers could build shit. Not necessarily cheaply, not necessarily so it worked, but they could build a lot of it. By January of 1944, 100 airframes had been, well, let's call it completed, even though we know they needed a shitload of rework. By July, that total was 500. By November, it was 1,000. By March 1945, it was 2,000, and in April 1945 alone, they were making 300 of these fucking things every fucking month. For an aircraft this big, this complex, those numbers are staggering. There were still crashes. Something like 742 Superfortresses were lost during the course of the war, 70% of them due to factors like weather, navigation, accidents, and of course quality problems. There's no question that the B-29 did have serious problems to it. 29% of all losses of the airframe occurred within the continental United States, a statistic which is mind-blowing when you put it next to the B-17 and B-24, where that number is more like 14%. Quality improved massively over the life of the aircraft, and later models were far, far better built and far, far better designed. One obvious sign of how things had improved is, of course, the cost. The ticket price went down from $2.6 million per airframe to $930K in 1945. Still a shitload, but an impressive reduction. The Truman Committee, Hap Arnold, General Wolfe, and a literal army of others got the project back on track, albeit far more slowly than they would have wanted to. And as I said at the start of this, by the end of the war, the B-29 program had cost $3.7 billion. That's about $80 billion in today's money, and almost $1.5 billion more than the Manhattan Project, but contributed directly to the end of the war. It saved a lot of lives through that contribution, and we're going to look at exactly how it did that in the near future. To me, the remarkable thing is that this flew in the war at all. So many other programs that suffered problems like this with engine failures and build problems didn't make it to production. I've noted a few times during the course of this, the pressure and the rush and the political will behind this project did cause it to tread on its own toes repeatedly, but without that same pressure, the B-29 may never have got into combat. When issues arose, the ability of Boeing and many others to respond is, in hindsight, astounding. From the women working round the clock on the line to the pilots who flew it, this was an exceptional program and a testament to the United States' industrial power, if not their build quality. The B-29 was a miracle. And I mean, assuming that your definition of a miracle is broad enough to include the odd exploding engine, congressional investigations, and a lot of things being on fire. What I haven't included in this is any discussion really at all of how it was going to get used or why, which has been an act of extreme self-restraint on my part. But the good news is we are going to discuss Operation Matterhorn, Meeting House, and many others very, very soon. So all that leaves me to do is to bid you adieu. Hope that you've enjoyed this, and if you have, encourage you to hit like and subscribe on the buttons below. Thank you very much.